The focus of this video is using descriptive statistics to compare groups. So what we know about descriptive statistics is it helps us organize, summarize, and communicate something about our data. Whether it's measures of central tendency or measures of variability, these values describe our data, whether it's the center or the spread. What we also can do with descriptive statistics is see patterns in the data, which allows us to compare groups. Is one group higher than the other, or is one group lower than the other? These are the things that we can determine with descriptive statistics. And comparing groups is typically our starting point, where we're looking at, comparing groups and seeing, is it warranted for us to examine this further using a more complex statistical test? And so oftentimes we start with descriptive statistics. Is there enough of a difference to warrant us to do more? But let's focus on applying what we've learned. So we want to compute the mean and standard deviation for 3 groups so that we can make a comparison. So we're looking at freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, and we're looking at their hours spent studying for a final exam. So there are 4 students in each of these groups, and they reported to the nearest hour their hours spent studying for the final exam. So we can see each of the groups have reported their values, and we want to compute the mean and standard deviation for each of these groups. So we're going to start with a little shortcut with a completed sum of squares table so that we can compute the standard deviation and then move towards our final goal, which is putting all the pieces together and creating an APA style interpretation, making sense of this group comparison, sort of communicating what is the patterns that we see. Okay, so we'll start with freshmen. Here's their sum of squares table. We have 4 of the students, and their reported hour studying. They had a mean of 1 and a sum of squares of 2. And we want to compute the standard deviation for this group. Before we do that, we need to compute our degrees of freedom. So in this case, our degrees of freedom, because we have 4 participants, it's 4 minus 1. That's the value that goes into the denominator of our standard deviation formula. And we're going to use the same degrees of freedom for all 3 groups because there's 4 students in each of the groups. So our degrees of freedom is 3. So we're going to plug in our values into our standard deviation. So we have our degrees of freedom of 3 and our sum of squares of 2. We see that in the table here. So the square root of 2 divided by 3, when we round it to 2 decimal places, is 0.82. So that's our mean is 1, standard deviation is 82 for freshmen. Let's do the same process for our sophomores. We don't need to compute our degrees of freedom. We already did that for minus 1 again. So they have a mean of 2 and a sum square of 6. So we're taking our sum square of 6 divided by our degrees of freedom of 3. So the square root of 6 divided by 3 gives us, when we round to 2 decimal places, 1.41. So for our sophomores, a mean of 2 and a standard deviation of 1.41. Then finally, we'll do the same process for our juniors. So again, we're going to compute our standard deviation here. So our sum of squares is 8. We're getting that from the table here. And our degrees of freedom is 3. So this gives us standard deviation of 1.61. And we have a mean of 4. Okay, so we have for freshmen a mean of 1, standard deviation of 0.82. For sophomores, a mean of 2 and a standard deviation of 1.41. And for juniors, a mean of 4 and our standard deviation of 1.63. So let's put all these pieces together. So an interpretation in sort of an APA style would be something like this. We could say that students that are juniors studied more. Why are we saying this? So if we started out by saying that juniors studied more, what we're looking at is the mean comparison. So if we go down here, juniors have a higher mean than sophomores and a higher mean than freshmen. So they're the highest. They spent the most amount studying. So we're saying it in words. And then in the parentheses, we are providing the evidence. And this is a key thing in APA style is we want to give the reader the values. We can't just say more and then not give them the evidence. We computed a mean of 4, and then we always report or typically report the standard deviation with that, so that gives them the average and then the variability that goes along with that mean. So the mean is 4, standard deviation is 1.63. And then we would say something that, so they studied more than sophomore students with a mean of 2 and a standard deviation of 1.41, and freshman students who had a mean of 1 and a standard deviation of 0.82. And then we could say something like, also junior students studied the most. And we know that. So if we look at this graph here, this is kind of helpful. We'll learn this in Jamovi. This is actually a graph from Jamovi. We can see that freshman was the lowest, then sophomore, and then junior. And this can be really helpful in determining our interpretations, because when we're looking at interpretations in assignments, this is often what we're faced with. We'll have some blanks. We need to fill in the blanks. These are the values that we're going to fill in, and then we need to make an assessment. So students that are juniors studied blank, then we provide the mean and standard deviation. What are we putting in here? Well, we put in more. We could have said higher, greater, whatever the value is, because 4 is higher than 2 and higher than 1. So when we're talking about interpretation, we're talking about comparing means. The standard deviations gives an additional piece of information to the readers about the variability of the sample. The mean is really where we're focusing on when we're interpreting the differences between groups. What is the difference between the means? Is one higher? Is one lower? How do we sort of figure that out? Well, we compute the values, and then we can really interpret what is the difference. We see a pattern. The juniors are higher than sophomores. The sophomores are higher than freshmen. So that's a little bit about interpretation. This is really scratching the surface. Doing APA style interpretation is a skill that will continue to build. There's lots to know. We really won't go through everything in this class, but we will learn how to interpret values in a more standardized way, which are based on the American Psychological Association's guidelines and conventions that they've set forth in their APA manual. Okay, so that's all I have for this video. Hopefully you found this informative. We'll be practicing this in another video using Jamovi output, and I hope that you found this helpful.